IBDP Extended Essay Cafe. My name is Susan, and like you, I have also been an educator. I was a psychology and TOK educator for 7 years in India, and now I'm currently working at the DP Learning and Engagement team at Toddle. As we wait for others to join, we'd love to know where you're joining us from. So if you could please put down your name and city in the chat box, we'd love to see, maybe you can get acquainted with the rest of your participants as well. Wow, we've got a lot of people joining us from all over the place. This is great. Devika from Bangalore, Sam from Bangkok, Reena from Tokyo, Ranjini from Mumbai, Arnaz from Mumbai, Paula from Dubai. Wow, we've got a lot of people. Rama from Indonesia, Trapti from Singapore, Zofia from Czech Republic. This is amazing. I can't believe we've got such a wide spread of participants today. We're so excited to have you here with us. Wow, wow, wow. I love reading these messages. Isolina from Peru. This is amazing. Murat from Turkey. Rana from Jordan. Welcome, welcome, welcome to all of you. Thank you so much for taking our time on a Saturday, for being with us today at this event. We are so happy to have you here with us. So as we go on with the session today, I'd just like to introduce Toddle to all of you. So Toddle is currently used by over 25,000 educators across over 1,100 PYP, MYP, and DP schools across the world. We have schools from the US, from Asia Pacific, from Europe, and the Middle East, and the program is also available in Spanish. Just like Toddle for PYP and MYP, Toddle for DP is a comprehensive end-to-end teaching and learning solution. The platform will include features like curriculum planning, a resource library, DP core modules, assessment, feedback, progress reports, student portfolios, family communication, classroom management. The list goes on and on, but it's your one-stop shop for all things DP. Before we move on to Emily, let's just go over a few housekeeping points for our session today. So we would love for you to keep your videos on or off, that's up to you, but definitely keep yourselves on mute. You can type in any questions that you have in the chat box. At many times, Emily might pause and ask you to reflect. You can use the chat feature to interact with the participants and with Emily. But when you are using the chat box, we request that you select the everyone feature so that everyone can see what you have to say. This meeting is developed independently from and is not endorsed by the IB. And as always, we thank our speakers for generously sharing their learnings at Toddle's EE Cafe. And now we can go on to our social media handles. Share your learnings from this session using our hashtag #EECafe, and our moderator is just going to drop in all our social media handles so that you can use either our LinkedIn, our Twitter, or our Instagram to share what you've learned about Emily's session today. And if you're attending any of the other sessions, then feel free to share about those too. And now on to today's session and agenda. So in today's session, we're going to be exploring general guidance pertaining to the extended essay with our speaker, Emily Stannard. Emily has been an extended essay coordinator at Bradfield College in Berkshire for the last 2 years and has been involved in overseeing EEs for 7 years as head librarian. During the lockdown, she formed part of the international collaboration of the extended essay known as the ICEE and was involved in planning and running 3 large international workshops. She is now chair of the ICEE and helps facilitate workshops at various stages of the EE process for students and supervisors. Emily is a big fan of the extended essay and makes it her mission to know as much as possible to best support students and supervisors through this process. We're so happy to have you here with us, Emily, and now over to you.
Thank you so much. It's really great to be here. It's a real pleasure to see so many people from so many different places. Some of you are up really early, I think. Welcome. Right, okay, so learning objectives for this session. So we've got quite a lot to go through, but I will try and make sure that I go through it at a pace that, that makes sense to everybody. So I'm going to be looking at, first of all, very briefly, the nature and specifics of the extended essay. My guess is that most of you, if not all of you, know something about the extended essay, so I'm not going to dwell too much on the basics. But I'm going to get really into kind of what I call kind of the meat of the session is really formulating a focused research question and what it means and how to help the students do this. I'm also going to be looking at the easy marks, which are what I call the easy marks, which are marks which are not necessarily linked to the content of the essay. So the first one is to do with criteria E and the reflection form. And the second one is looking at criteria D and the format and presentation of the essay. So I'm going to try and give you a bit of an overview of, a bit of like what I do with the students, and also, trying to, as an EE coordinator, what I do to try and make sure that we can bolster those marks so the students at least get a pass in the EE, which obviously is important. Okay, so just looking very briefly at the nature of the extended essay. As you probably know, it's up to 4,000 words long. So that means that the examiner will not read beyond 4,000 words. So the student really must make sure that it is 4,000 words or below. It's driven by the student, and I think that this is often different from some of the qualifications that we offer, certainly in the UK, in that it's very much an independent learning project, and the student really has to drive this. They say in the IB it's about 40 hours of research and writing time. Some students will take more, some students may take less. It's approximately 40 hours of their own independent learning time. It's a compulsory part of the IB diploma, obviously. It's externally assessed, which again is different from some of the qualifications that we offer here in the UK, in that the supervisor does not have to mark the extended essay. They have to provide a predicted grade based on the grade descriptors, but they don't have to formally give a mark for the essay, and there's no moderation. It just goes off to the IB and then is externally assessed. An E grade is a failing grade for the diploma. So if they get an E in their EE, they will fail their entire diploma. It's the same with TOK. The TOK and the EE make up the core marks of 3, at maximum 3. And obviously the higher the grades in EE and TOK, the higher the number of points that they'll get in the core. So it's really important. What I make it as my mission as an EE coordinator is to make sure these students have the best possible opportunity to pass the EE, and then the supervisor really is the one who does the rest of the work in terms of the content. Okay, so those are the basics there for the EE. Some practical guidance, if any of you are EE coordinators, it's really up to your school to decide on the timeline of the extended essay. So if you're setting out and sorting out your extended essay, really it's your school who decides that. I'd say that the majority of schools and the colleagues that I've worked with, the EE tends to run from term 1 in DP1 through to term 1 or term 2 in DP2. Now, the key thing, the reason that the IB diploma coordinator has to have oversight of this is because the internal assessments is really good to have a big calendar of 2 years over the course of the IB diploma program to make sure that the internal assessments are spaced out enough so that the EE kind of works around those and there's not too many kind of really crunch points. I mean, I'd say that term 1 in DP2 for us is one of the heaviest terms in terms of the workload. And that is when the EE is due. The EE should be due just before October half term in our school. Sometimes students miss the deadlines, the internal deadlines, and things slip, and then it starts to impact on their IA. So having a good 2-year oversight of the calendar is actually really useful. And I work very closely with the IBDP coordinator to make sure that students aren't impacted too heavily. Librarians are central to the EE process because the EE is a research project. If your school does not have a librarian, I'd suggest that you kind of make a case to get one, because they can bring in so much. And later on, you're going to hear from Kuntal, who is amazing. She will give you so many tips and views of how a librarian works. As a librarian myself, I've been central to the EE process even before I was a coordinator, just giving research skills, providing the resources, and being able to help students just find the information that they need to for their research project. Okay, extended essay subjects. Some people say, well, if we're doing a standard level, can the student do an E in that? Yes, they can. It depends on your school. So our school used to have a policy that students could only write their extended essay in higher level subjects. I've pushed back on that and said, actually, if you've got a student who's really passionate about a subject they're doing at standard level, maybe they're not doing it at high level because maybe there's a timetable issue, or maybe, I don't know, they want to focus on maybe more scientific subjects at high level, but actually they want to write a creative subject at standard level, whatever it is. If they're doing it as part of their diploma course, I would say absolutely they can write their EE in it. And something like ESS, for example, will only ever be standard level, and they can write an EE in that. And you've got some interdisciplinary EEs, which are also looked on very favourably by the IB. So that's literature and performance and world studies, which has to be a combination of 2 diploma subjects. I'll cover world studies a little bit more, but I know that there's a subject session on this later with Love, who again is amazing and knows everything there is to know about world studies essays. So I can highly recommend his session. Just a few notes on ethical guidelines. And again, in your subject sessions, you probably will cover these anyway. So these are specifically for group 3, 4, and sometimes 6 subjects. So group 3 is obviously individuals and societies, group 4 is the sciences, and group 6 is the arts. So things like, you know, I mean, again, it's really common sense, actually. You know, being sensitive, the students need to be sensitive to local and international cultures. They shouldn't do anything which causes anxiety, stress, pain, or discomfort for participants, particularly in scientific experiments. I'm thinking particularly sports or science generally, or also, you know, questionnaires for economics, business, and that sort of thing. You know, obviously no coercion, deception, or privacy invasion, avoiding conducting research with any adult who's not in a fit state of mind, giving the participant the opportunity to withdraw at any stage in the process. So this is very much like a university level, almost like a psychology assessment, where you fill in a questionnaire, you fill in your consent form, and as a participant, you must make sure that, you know, if you're uncomfortable at any point, you have the right to withdraw from that, and the student must honour that. They have to make sure that consent is gained before starting the research. So, you know, good idea for the student to bring up, to draft a consent form, perhaps with their supervisor, just to say, you know, you consent to taking part in this research. This is what it's all about. So they've got to be told about the aims and objectives and be shown the results of the research. Again, it's quite important that that's something that's actually in the IB ethical guidelines. So the student needs to share the results of the research with their participants. There must be written consent if there are children involved from parents and guardians. And if the research is being conducted in a school, then written consent of the teachers also must be obtained. And my assumption is that if you're going out of your own school, then you need to, you know, you're doing it in another school, and you must make sure that you've got consent from teachers also. Okay, a little note on data protection. Again, you know, personal data, very important with all of the laws and regulations around that. So again, if the participant withdraws, the student must get rid of all the data. The students have to guarantee anonymity. The data collected has to be kept in a confidential and responsible manner, whether it's collected in person or online. Data collected online has to be deleted once the research is completed. You know, there should be no reason for them to keep personal data longer than the project. And again, not using the data for any purpose other than conducting the research. So just, you know, and I'm sure that, you know, in your particular groups, the subjects that you go into will kind of cover these anyway. Specific policies and subjects. So again, what I say, you know, particularly group 3 and group 4, but also if you've got interviews. So for example, we had an art student who did an interview with an artist about his drug addiction, which obviously is quite a sensitive area. So, you know, just being mindful of those sorts of things, and, you know, perhaps when they're dealing with sensitive subjects, making sure that the student is appropriately equipped and knows how to respond emotionally and, you know, correctly with the people that they're interviewing. Students have to read and follow the ethical guidelines. Again, if you're supervisors in these subjects, you really need to know about this. If relevant, they need to read the animal experimentation policy, which also covers, you know, humans as well. They're very limited in terms of what you can actually do. You know, obviously no blood or saliva or you know, human fluids other than, you know, perhaps their own. But you know, just being very careful with what they do. Experiments involving animals have to be based on observing and measuring aspects of natural animal behaviour. Interestingly, we had an EE a few years ago in biology where the student was really keen to look at dogs' dental health, and she actually had, you know, was observing and giving dental chews to dogs and different types of dental chews, and then she was observing that, and she did quite well actually. I think she got a B or an A. So it's that sort of thing, you know, making sure that if you're giving anything to animals, then you're making sure that it's humane, that you're not kind of giving them anything kind of steroids or anything like that, which wouldn't be acceptable. Okay, so moving on from kind of the hardcore science things, there are some subjects which have specific rules. So these 3 are the subjects which have specific rules attached to them. Economics has a 5-year rule, so students cannot write about anything that is older than 5 years. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean that, you know, for example, if there's a policy which comes up and then the policy is still being implemented in the past 5 years, or there's still things which are going on. For example, we did one this year. We had a plastic, we had a sugar tax actually. A sugar tax was introduced into the UK law. I don't even know how many years ago it was, it's over 5 years ago, but there are still repercussions of that policy now. It's still current. So we had a student this year writing about sugar tax in terms of how it's affecting consumer choice in economics, and that is acceptable as far as I understand. History must be 10 years or later, so it's not obviously current. So anything historical is 10 years ago or more, which is counted as history. And world studies has got to be within the student's lifetime. So it's got to be a global issue of contemporary significance. So that word contemporary just means how long the student has been alive. So they can't take something, for example, like the Rwandan genocide, because that's further away than their own lifetime. They have to take something that's a current global issue. Okay, just a quick note on double dipping. Interestingly, that's why I've got this picture here. In the UK, we have a sweet called a double dip, and this is every time double dipping is mentioned in the IB, I always think of this, and it's just a sherbet flavoured dip. But anyway, students have to make sure they don't duplicate any work that they submit for their IAs in their EE and vice versa. So this is very important, and supervisors and teachers really must be on top of this as well. Specifically, this means that any data that they collect for one, either one, must not be used in the other. Now, this changes a bit with literature and language. So students must not write about a text that they're studying on their DP course, and that's the whole of their diploma course, so the whole 2 years. They can choose the same author, but they have to choose a different text, particularly when it comes to literature. So that you must make sure about that. So I am constantly liaising with the head of English, which is our English A, to make sure that as soon as I get the choices in from the students about what they want to write about, I say to him, please don't teach this at all on the whole of their diploma program, because they can't do this because they're writing the EE on it. So again, just making sure as an EE coordinator, you need to be on it in terms of what the students are wanting to write about, and making sure that there is no possibility for any crossover in their subjects. Okay, so that's sort of the background really from me. So what I now want to focus on is what I do with the students. So the way that I run it, I start the extended essay off. I introduce it to the students in November of DP1, and I will tell them all about the extended essay, and I will give them some example questions from previous year's students, and that will be in every subject that I know that they're studying, plus world studies and some of the interdisciplinary subjects, so that they've got an idea of what's involved and what they could possibly write about in each subject to help them to come to a decision about what topic they might want to think about. It's very daunting for the students at the beginning. It's very daunting to know, what am I going to think about and talk about? If you've got students who really have no idea, I always point them back to their teachers, back to their textbooks, and just say, have a think, have a read, do some wider reading, do some current research, something that might be important to you. What is really important to you? What are you really interested in? Because half the battle with the EE is making sure that you're interested in whatever it is that you're writing about. So you should be able to come up with something. So the research question really has to be focused, because it will guide and focus the research and the essay. 9 times out of 10, students lose marks in the EE because their research question is too broad, unfocused, can't be answered in 4,000 words. It has to be focused because it helps address an issue rather than just talking around a topic. Again, some of the students just if it's not focused enough, they just end up trying to put down everything that they know about the topic. And again, that doesn't make for a good essay. It's got to have an answer or a solution. And that can't be just a yes or no answer. And it has to be justified with reasoned academic arguments within the limits of 4,000 words. So I'm just going to take a quick question here. Justine, you've said, can they write about a text they took before DP? Yes, as long as they're not studying it on the diploma programme, and as long as the text falls within the parameters of being of literary enough merit, for your literature. So it's got to be of literary merit. So that means there's got to be at least some literary criticism or something about it out there that they can actually bring into their essay. Okay, so moving on from the research question. For the EE specifically, the research question forms part of criteria A, which is all about the focus and the method. they've got to, within criteria A, they've got to explain their research focus, which includes the research question, the methodology, so how the research is going to be undertaken, and how their focus will be maintained through the essay. And these are concepts that are quite often difficult for a student to unpick, particularly how the focus will be maintained through the essay. So it's just focusing on kind of, the methodology and sort of summarizing what they are going to write about. Okay. What I would say, most of criterion A exists in the introduction of the essay. And these, again, are things that, as an EE coordinator, I tend to focus on these kind of marks which are going to help them to get marks elsewhere in the essay, so the other criteria. So within criterion A, in the topic, has it been contextualized? Have they put the topic in context of the research question? What's their justification for this topic's worthiness of study? Is the research question appropriate for a 4,000-word essay? Is it clearly stated in the introduction? Again, some of my students lose marks because they don't clearly state the research question in the introduction. They don't have to state it word for word necessarily, but it's got to be really obvious in the introduction. Is it focused, and is it based on background knowledge and understanding of the subject area? So wider reading at the beginning is really important for the student to place the research question in context. Is the focus maintained throughout the essay? So that's kind of goes into other criterion as well. And the methodology, so, is there evidence in the introduction that the student has made informed source and method selection in terms of choosing the most appropriate sources and or methods to use for the subject discipline to gather the information? So, how have they decided, within science, methodology is, how you're going to go about doing your experiment, how you're going to go about collecting your primary data. If it's secondary data, how you've gone about choosing particular studies. For literature, it's about, how much do you know about the text itself? What sort of critical sources are you bringing in to work on your argument? How does the student explain how they've narrowed the scope of their range of sources methods in order to address the research question? So I see this particularly in history. It's quite important in a history essay to make sure that you include some of those sources which have been really key, for answering your question, and which ones you're going to bring in to be able to argue your way through the essay. Getting from a topic to a question, again, this is something that my students particularly struggle with. And this is really important to make sure that it's part of the introduction to the extended essay. So you've got to encourage your students to ask all these questions: how, what, why, so what? Okay, so they might come to me with a question, and I might say, well, so what? How are you going to answer that around the general topic? And any research resources which they have read. So making a list. So they could, to focus their question, they could pick a specific case study. Perhaps there's something in, I don't know, maybe something kind of medical ethics that they want to look at, or a case study in psychology that they want to specifically look at. They could focus on a particular geographical area to narrow it down, maybe to a town or an area. Focus on a particular demographic. So they could narrow it by age or ethnicity, or they could focus on a specific event or cause or character or theme or policy. So, for example, I have a student this year who wanted to do a history essay. She wanted to pick a strong woman in history, a leader, but she wasn't sure who. So she had to go away and do some more research and think about, which historical era she wanted to focus on, come up with a few characters, and she's eventually settled on Elizabeth I. So that's a good way of coming down. And again, policy and theme, quite good for history essays too. The supervisor must not come up with a research question. It's really important. So, it's very important that the supervisor guides, but doesn't come up with the research question. You can kind of suggest things to them, but they have to come up with a question themselves. Okay, focusing the research question. This is an exercise that I do with the students, and actually they find it quite useful. So we call this the exploding terms exercise. So this might be a question that they've come up with. Now, obviously, this question would be far too broad for an extended essay. So I say, we'll actually take each part of the question and just explode it out. So what does how mean? How means, is it their mood? Is it their work? Is it their concentration? Is it their employment? How is it affecting these women? Then you look at depression. Okay, there's many different, anyone who's a psychologist will know there's many different types of depression. So are you looking at major, manic, psychotic, postnatal, seasonal affective disorder? You know, what kind of depression? You can't take all of the depression, but focus on maybe one or two, or focus specifically on one. Affect, what do you mean by affect? So how are you going to measure that? Are you going to measure that by surveys or experiments? Are you going to look at focus groups? Are you look at secondary data? How are you looking at measuring the effect of this? And then women. So, okay, so do you mean all women, or do you actually want to specify an age group or country, ethnicity? Do you want to compare and contrast? So, you know, actually taking this and then exploding these terms helps them to then focus, going, oh, actually, perhaps I want to look at this, or maybe actually I'm going to go away and do some research in this. And it just gives them a bit more, you know, a bit more kind of an insight into the question that they're looking at. Then it can mean that they can focus. So, for example, these are much better questions. How does seasonal affective disorder affect mood in adolescent British Indian women aged 16 to 19? Perfect. Nice and narrow, very focused, you know, and it's going to allow them to go and look at specific case studies for this. You know, this obviously is a psychology essay. Or how does postnatal depression impact women aged 40 to 50 and maintaining employment in Britain? Again, really good. You know, there should be some really good case studies, maybe not necessarily to do with Britain, but you should be able to find some elsewhere and bring in these particular studies to be able to look at this. So much more focused. So I thought we could try one. So what is the effect of on the environment from global warming? So I've got a Padlet, which I think is going to be in the chat. If you want to just post your ideas of, you know, how can we make this question more focused? That would be quite good. I've got a Padlet on my other screen here, which I can see as you post things. So feel free to do that. And in the meantime, I will just check and see if there are any more questions that I need to answer that. Look at. Right, let me just look in the chat. Okay, there's going to be quite a lot of questions on there. I mean, hopefully the moderator will also go through some of these at the end, and I will be able to answer some as well. And then any questions that are left over, I will answer as well, just on the back of, you know, just typing them. So some for the moderator, obviously. Let's have a look. Yeah, so Sophia, you say teacher and student turnover may impact student progress on the E if it spans over the 2 DP years. Yeah, so sometimes, you know, your student might leave halfway through the year and go somewhere else. It's really up to the other school as to whether they kind of continue. The student will say what they've been doing. They can take that with them and they can carry on there if they can. If they can't, they probably have to start the process again. If the teacher leaves, and we do have this quite a lot at our school, if the teacher leaves at the end of the academic year DP1, we make sure that there's a good handover between them and the supervisor who will be taking it on from them, making sure that this current supervisor, the leaving supervisor, provides notes and sends them to the other supervisor so that they are able to then write a supervisor comment on that. So yeah, so if you on the Padlet, if you could just give me some examples, you know, how you would make it more focused, and then, you know, give me some questions which might be better than that one. That would be really good. World studies, any 2 DP subjects, or is there a combination possible given by IB? So Gina, yeah, any 2 DP subjects. I mean, it's up to your school. We, you know, for example, we don't offer business management here, so we would not encourage a world studies essay which covered the business management as one, because it's very difficult for a student to do an essay in something that we don't offer. Now, we had a student just this year actually was submitting one which they've done a world studies essay, and they wanted to do it on genetics and ethics, or genetic modification. And she's done it on biology and philosophy. Now, we don't offer philosophy, but our TOK teacher does teach A-level philosophy. So he agreed to be one of her advisors on this, and she had to learn the course. And we did this as well for somebody who did wanted to do economics as one of their subjects, but didn't take it. So she, again, had to learn it. But we only tend to offer these to our students who are really capable of doing this. So, you know, otherwise I would really warn against it, because it's very difficult to write an interdisciplinary essay on a subject that you don't really know much about. So it's very important to do that. Yep, somebody else looking. Yep, Yeah, well done, people answering questions. It's really good. Animal experimentation policies should be on the IB, my IB. Oh, very good. Global politics. Yes, actually, interestingly, we're just starting to offer global politics next year. So that's one that I will be on my radar. Thank you very much, Lauren. It's got to be contemporary within their lifetime. Can a student pick a subject that's not taught at school? I've just covered that, so that's right. EE, no, EE doesn't take precedence over English set texts, Robert. So I would say, the teachers set the text, but I will talk to the teachers. And if the teacher is definitely teaching that text, thankfully we haven't had that. There is some flexibility in what the teachers can teach and want to teach. So they might sort of say, well, actually, we're planning to teach that. And if that's the case, I'll say to the student, don't take that as your EE text. It's up to you how you run it. It's completely up to you how you run it, but it's just the way that it works in our school. I'll take this as the last one. Let's have a look. So I think some people have been answering. This is great, guys. Feel free to answer yourselves because that's also really good. I will just take, let's have a look. Examples of languages. No, I mean, you can write an E. So in group B, you can write an E in Spanish, German, I think any other language, as long as it's a group B language, English B. And English B, yeah, it does include language and literature, English A and B. You cannot have a student doing a text in their language acquisition or their language, their first language, which is covered on the DP course, which they only want to write the E. And so we had one this year as well. The student herself, she was doing Spanish B and she wanted to do an EE in the play that they were actually studying on the course. And I said, you can't do that. So you're going to have to choose a different one, maybe from the same author. Okay, right. Great. So up here on the Padlet, we've got some good things here. To what extent has the environment been affected by global warming in Thailand? Yeah, I would question, specifically what aspect of the environment, how are you going to measure that, that sort of thing. So it could be better. What's the effect on the rainforest from global warming? Yeah, again, rainforest in which country? Not bad. Yeah, effects of global warming particularly. So again, thinking about global warming and what that actually means, and so a specific thing. So I think my suggestion to the students for this one, whether I put it on here or not, when I put it on my slides, one of my suggestions to students was something about the melting of the polar ice caps and the impact on the penguin population in Antarctica. So again, something nice and focused that is there. Just a quick question from Davika. What do you do to get students to focus or select texts with literary merits? In other words, how do they know or determine the literary? Yeah. Determining the literary merit is difficult, particularly when it comes to young adult fiction. But again, as EE coordinator and as your subject specialist in your area, your teachers, your supervisors, determining literary merit, it's just again looking to see what is out there in terms of criticism or authors discussion. As long as there is enough in the text to be able to drill down into, then you should be okay. But if you're looking at something like, for example, something that doesn't have, and think of an example of something that doesn't have a lot of literary merit, a children's book, for example, I don't know, Peppa Pig wouldn't have a literary merit because what are you actually going to write about? You've got to think about, can I write about this in 4,000 words? Am I going to be able to talk about themes or a specific literary, idea or something like that? Okay, let's move on. So, because I'm conscious of time. Types of research question. This is really, really useful, actually. And I have to say, I'm indebted to my colleague, Sergey, who ran a session for the ICEE on focusing a research question and how to do it. And this, I've kind of picked up on really what he's done. So when you've got a question that's factual, what do, a lot of them start with what or is, and some of this is picked up from the IB, some of the IB exemplars. Some of these are our own schools exemplars back in the day. If you were just looking at the what and what does it say about human behavior when they struggles, these types of research questions are not going to score very well for focus and methods, so criterion A. And it will also impact on critical thinking because actually, you're not able to analyze the question as well as the question is not allowing you to go into the detail, is basically what I'm saying. So we had an essay in economics, is the gender pay gap around prize money and men's and women's tennis really closing? This really didn't do well at all. As you can see, focus and method of critical thinking really low, because she just didn't really, it's just not a great question, because you could kind of say yes, no, but there wasn't really any analytical argument. She didn't really use any economics in it, and you've got to be quite specific when it comes to econ essay. What is the impact of oligopoly on consumers in the gaming industry? Again, what, not really allowing you to express. Does the warm-up of martial arts influence? Influence is better because you've got a bit of context there, but it still didn't get a particularly good mark. So just being careful with factual questions. Now, conceptual questions are better because you're actually looking at the concepts within the subject. And this is something that the IB really wants in terms of the EE assessment criteria. So they want you to think about the concepts. The concepts here are in brown, and again, mental health and rurality. So this person, even though they've got a what question, they're looking at the relationship between mental health and rurality. So suddenly this geography question becomes a lot better because they're comparing across. It gives them an opportunity to analyze mental health and rurality in working together. So they got, again, much higher focus of method, much higher in critical thinking. ITGS essay, what does the collapse of the Mt. Gox exchange suggest about the implications, again, kind of conceptual implications, Bitcoin and blockchain technology? What is the effect of decreasing the temperature on the reaction rate and rate constant? So you've got this kind of nice conceptual analysis going on. So I'd say conceptual questions require students to justify their choice, predict what happens next, explain why something happens, and explain how something happens. So getting much more deeper than just the what, linking two or more areas or topics, recognize questions phrased in a novel way, and extracting useful data from an excess of information. All these skills which are really given given credence within the extended essay assessment criteria. And this is why these questions score more highly in criterion A, which then has a knock-on impact on critical thinking, because then it helps them to score more in criteria C as well. Moving on from conceptual questions to arguable or analytical questions. So the first question is one of our former film extended essays. Generally you find this to what extent questions, because then that gives the student the chance to really go into kind of the whys and the whats and the wherefores. Inspired by the filmography, then she did really well, got an A. All these questions, I think, got an A. And again, the third one is one of ours, socioeconomic position, ethnicity affecting levels of oral health. So her dad was a dentist, so she wanted to look at this for geography, did really well, got an A, and so on and so forth. So using specific question words and techniques to make it a debatable question, because then that really helps the student. Thinking about, what am I going to use this concept for? What is my contribution to this particular subject, topic area? Am I going to compare and contrast? So you've got this kind of analytical, so to what extent will allow you to go into an analytical argument about an essay? And again, this is where good things come from. So I would say that the key to a strong research question, and again, thanks to Sergey for this one, is a clear analytical focus, a subject-specific conceptual lens, because that's also what the IB want for the extended essay in criterion B, and a detailed and rich factual context. So putting it in the context of the facts with that subject-specific conceptual lens and having a clear analytical focus will lead to a very strong research question, which will then help the student achieve better in criterion A and criterion C, and hopefully also criterion B as well. Okay, so in terms of phrasing the questions, thinking about the command terms that are used, again, your supervisors are probably much more able to answer these than me, but what I would say to the students is, I know to what extent it feels like it's overused, but actually it's still a very good way of phrasing a question. Or say, if you want to mix it up, you could say how far or how effective, because these will allow you to consider the merits of an argument or a concept. The EE says, opinions and conclusions should be presented clearly and supported with evidence and sound arguments. When they're writing, they just need to make sure their points are backed up with this evidence, and their argument runs through the essay. Always got to think about the question. I say to our students as well, when you're writing your essay, write out your research question on a piece of paper and have it next to you, or make sure it's at the top of every page you're writing on. Make sure that every paragraph you're writing links back to the question somehow. You've got to make sure that you're arguing and responding to the question that you've posed. If you go off topic, then it kind of detracts from your argument, because it suddenly gets into other areas and you can get distracted. So it's got to be nice and clear. These require an in-depth assessment of the topic and the evidence used to present the argument. It shows, your knowledge on a given subject and, your analytical style in stating your position, considering both sides of the argument and presenting contrasting pieces of evidence. Again, being able to argue and analyze and weighing up different positions is really good. So ultimately you have to show why a particular set of evidence or piece of information is valid for supporting your answer. And this comes back to the source selection, which runs through the assessment criteria for the EE. So very important. Preeti, I'm just going to answer your question. For the EE, does the student have to offer individual opinion based on research as well, backed up by evidence? Yeah, I would say individual opinion is absolutely useful, based on research, of course. So absolutely they can put in their own opinion, provided that it's valid and it's sort of backed up as well. Right, yep, so, okay. Here's some useful ways. Again, I just give this to the students. Here's some useful ways to phrase a research question: to what extent or degree, how effective is, how have the decisions of X affected Y, how significant is, what is the best or cheapest, quickest method for, in light of X, how can one understand Y, what has been the influence of Y on X on Y and Y on Z or whatever. So, some interesting and useful ways of kind of doing, if you don't want to use to what extent, you've got a written version to that, there are other ways of phrasing the question. The checklist that I share with the students as well, again, for me, the most important thing is, apart from passing the essay, the most important thing is getting the question right. Because if the question is wrong, the essay will be less good and in some cases really poor. So is the question clear? Will the examiner understand the nature of the research? Will the question direct or guide the research? If not, go back, rephrase, think again. Is the question focused? Is there enough time to answer the question in a meaningful way? Are 4,000 words enough to provide a detailed and meaningful answer to this question? So it's got to be focused, got to be answered within those 4,000 words. They're not writing a PhD thesis. They haven't got 90,000 words, they've only got 4. And it feels a lot to them because they've probably not done anything like this before, but it's got to be very specifically focused. And so many students in the process of writing suddenly realize that actually their question is too broad, they need to continue to focus it. Is the question arguable, analytical, debatable? Does the question allow for analysis and or evaluation based on evidence? Does the question invite the development of a reasoned argument? Now, bearing in mind that this is a research essay and they've got to use the research within their argument to balance it up. Yes, they can include their opinion, but the whole essay should not just be about their opinion. It should be about the evidence that they're producing and the way that they can argue their point of view based on the evidence. Okay, some tips on doing the research. I'm only going to touch on this because Kuntal will deliver an amazing session later on being a librarian and how the librarian can support the EE. Again, on top of my list is always use the library and the librarian. And I think every IB school should have one because there is a specific part of the guide which is specifically for librarians and librarians in the IBDP process. Direct the students to high quality academic research resources. So many essays I see which don't get good marks, apart from the fact that the research question may be wrong, but even if the research question is right, if the student has not used high quality research resources, the examiner will see that and actually the evidence will not be as strong as it could have been. So one of the first things that I would do if I was an examiner, I'd go and have a look at their bibliography and I'd look and see how many resources were from academic journals and how many were just from kind of websites or blogs or whatever else. If there's too many kind of generic websites, blogs, even Wikipedia, I would think actually this essay is probably not going to be as high quality as it should be. So students, I would always advocate students should read a lot of journal articles around their chosen topic. Now, this is quite difficult to do. It's a difficult skill because students aren't necessarily introduced to journal articles. So I would say, trying to encourage them to go to some open databases, to have a look at some journal articles on their particular subject, maybe topic, and getting them to read and understand how an abstract works, how to read a journal article, reading the introduction, reading the conclusion, reading the abstract, looking at the evidence within the article, deciding whether it's actually a useful article to them to use or not. These are all really good skills that your librarian can help you with. And can help your students with. And so I would always advocate that. Zakir Hussain is another EE coordinator who's on the EE Facebook group, and he has produced an amazing source of open access databases, which I think will be shared in the link with you anyway. this is brilliant. So particularly if your school doesn't have a library or a librarian and you don't have any subscription-based resources, there's some brilliant resources on here for each subject. So it's really, really good. I would always say try exercises like asking students to create an annotated bibliography of several of their sources. So one thing I get the students to do is after they've done their wider reading in November, December, over Christmas, I ask them to produce an annotated bibliography. And that means that they need to go into more detail, more depth with their sources, looking at journal articles and actually writing, a summary of the source and how it's going to be useful to answer their research question. So it just helps to focus their reading a bit. Primary data collection, something else I do with the students is making sure that they understand how to produce a questionnaire survey and do an interview, because the students doing primary research, I've seen some terrible, terrible surveys in my time where they haven't really thought about what they're trying to collect, and it doesn't really lend itself to answering their research question. So they've got to think carefully about what they need before they collect it. So I talk to them a bit about how to create good surveys, which allow them to gather data without asking leading questions. And also I bring in somebody from our marketing department to talk to them about how to shape interviews and interview questions and to run interviews, when you allow the interviewer to speak and when you sort of give them questions specifically and how you kind of guide them in that discussion. So again, some really key skills here, which you can just call on other people in your school to help you with, because it's really useful. Okay, extended essay and the internal assessment. I'm just going to take some water. So just to clarify between these two, the differences between the two of them, there are differences. I know that particularly in the sciences, it feels like the extended essay is basically an longer internal assessment. I've seen marks from science essays which suggest otherwise. What the examiner doesn't want to see is basically a long internal assessment. They actually want to see that the student has done a literature review, so that they've actually looked at the literature and they put the question in context, that they haven't necessarily followed the formula for the internal assessment, but they have contained some. So for example, one of our students was marked down in a chemistry essay last year because she'd given a whole list of resources that she'd used, and she'd basically modeled her essay on the internal assessment, which the examiner clearly didn't like, although he didn't write any comments on it, but there was obviously lost marks in criterion A for that one. So just being careful and making sure that, non-essential raw data is in the appendix, and that you've only got your kind of consolidated data in the extended essay, in the body of the essay. You can have a look here, you can read here, but basically, the IA focuses really on the application of the scientific method to a problem of interest, will only include some background information, but the EE is all about the student's ability to analyse and evaluate scientific arguments. And whether that's through primary data or through secondary data, that is the purpose of the extended essay. So it's not just a long IA, it does have its own format and the way that it's run. Okay, I am going to whiz through the last few of my slides because I'm conscious of time, and I will try and take some questions. Interpreting the assessment criteria, here's the criteria. I say, A to C largely is on the supervisor's shoulders. D to E, I will have some input into that because I can help the students with those, what I call easier marks. Criterion A, again, is all about getting the question right. Once you've got the question right, I think criterion A tends to flow from there. How the EE examiners apply the criteria, they apply it using a best fit model. So they have, and you'll be able to see on the IB assessment criteria that you've got the boundaries, the brackets for each one. So for example, just going back here, so there are 6 marks for criteria A, so you'd have 1 to 2, 3 to 4, 5 to 6, which would be the higher brand. They basically look at it in terms of the subject-specific interpretations. They look to find the descriptor that most accurately conveys the level attained by the student's work. And they are weighing it up. So they might meet 2 of the 3 requirements in a mark band, but the other one requirement might not have been met. So it might be presentation for criterion C, it's presentation of research, it is discussion and evaluation, and it's analysis. So their analysis and their research might be high, but their discussion and evaluation might be lower. So the examiner will then choose the lower end of that mark band. Again, I'm sure that the subject guys will go into some detail on this. Right, what I would say, easy marks, reflection on planning and progress. So this is criterion E. And this is where I think really you can help the students, because they this has really nothing to do with the essay. It's all about the process of it. And there are 3 reflections with your 3 supervisor sessions totaling 500 words. And I give them a bit of a guidance in terms of how many words approximately you should write for each session. But again, for each reflection, it's very much up to the students. It's just a very big guide. You can get a maximum of 6 marks for this. And this is where I think we can really come into our own as EE coordinators to help this, to teach the students, like, what is a reflection? How do you do a reflection? What should it look like? Running the formal reflection sessions, I'm not going to kind of touch too much on this, other than the supervisor just needs to, to lead them, guide them, ask them questions, help them to develop ideas for the essay in terms of their strategies, outlining next steps, that sort of thing. Key focus should be the process, demonstrating conceptual understanding. Does the student understand the concept that they're looking at in their subject area? The skills, how they're developing their skills, high-level skills like critical thinking, research methodology. What are their learning experience? Have any new perspectives come out about from this process? So here's the mark bands that I was talking about. So, engagement is excellent all the way through to engagement is limited. It's all about the student engagement with their research focus. So it's very, very much, has the student engaged with their research focus? Have they, does it look like they're really passionate about their subject? Have they done a lot of reading? And what it looks like in practice is really this, have they been able to reflect on the research process, for example? Have they evaluated decisions? Does the examiner get an insight into the student's thinking, intellectual initiative, and creative approach? Is the student voice present rather than the supervisors? I would always say you can talk about when your supervisor has helped you, but largely there should be I in this. In criterion E, in the reflections, it's all about the I did this, I did that, this is what I've learned from it. Analysis and evaluation, again, analytical writing, if they write a sentence, get them to question, why, how, so what, okay, so reflection is a lot about so what, like, why do I need to know about that? Evaluation is the process of making the assessment or a judgment about something. So they need to re-examine the EE Germany in life, what they already know, what they intended to discover, and integrating any new knowledge there. So I've got an example of an RPPF with 6 marks. It's one of our literature students a few years ago who, again, got very high marks. So in the yellow is the student voice. So, appeal to me, to venture with my curiosity. I read a number of texts, and out of those I was particularly captured. I could draw connections. I've been particularly interested by, again, very heavy student voice, very good, which was good. So it was about 136 words. In her second reflection, I decided to focus on, I formed my ideas, again, student voice, really present throughout. And then in blue, her supervisor. So my supervisor gave me some helpful advice. So she's identified a challenge. I found the style of writing a challenge, but she's identified a way of a solution. So her supervisor has helped her with this, introduced the essay in terms of setting up my argument in a confident way, making sure I address the research question. So, if you've had help from your supervisor, acknowledge it. It's a good thing. And in her final reflection, again, in blue, she's, appealed to me. I would have liked to read more about literary modernism, also realise the importance of enrichment. I think, my colours have changed slightly here. So, but she's found some new angles in her research, what she would have liked to have done before. So she's reflecting on what would have helped her more, realise the importance of enrichment, following every reference in the poem back to its original source. For example, so, she could have just have left it at that. What I say to the students is like, okay, well, so what? Can you give me an example? And then you can give an example and say, what you want to, and then what it's doing for future. Look forward to expanding my reading in the future. So she's a student who's clearly very passionate about her subject area, and she's done a lot of reading for it. Bit of a whistle-stop tour. I will come back to questions in a minute, promise. The last little bit of my presentation is all about formatting. A format and presentation. These are 4 marks which students should not be foregoing, okay? So when I took over as extended essay coordinator, a lot of our students were getting 1s and 2s in format and presentation. That was not acceptable to me. So I make sure that I run specific sessions in September when their drafts come in. So the students sit in the session and I show them how to format an essay. How do you create a contents page? How do you create a title page? What do you need on that title page? How do you add page numbers? What's your bibliography look like? Is it in alphabetical order? That sort of thing. It's not necessarily all about that, because there is an element of this which is on the argument of the essay. Does the argument flow through the essay? But if the presentation looks good, they can at least get 3 marks here. I mean, it should be really easy. If they get 3 marks here and 3 marks in the reflections, they've got a 6, they've got a pass. And that to me is the most important thing. I don't want any students failing the essay on silly things which they could have sorted out. So, again, you could pick this up from elsewhere, but this is, basically how you should format it. So I'll just give you some examples. Here's one from an English essay that we had last year. The title page, you can see on the title page, you've got the title, you've got the research question, you've got the subject, you've got the word count. That's what you need on the title page. Table of contents looks good. Page numbers refer to the pages where these come. As an English essay, she didn't need the subject headings within her essay, but she's just highlighted whereabouts you're going to be able to find these particular themes within her essay. And her bibliography is nicely laid out on a separate page at the end of the essay. An example of an essay which actually really didn't do very well at all. You can see that there is no title page, there's no contents page. He's got his research question, but it's on the start of his essay. He hasn't double spaced it, which is necessary to do. He's put the word count at the end of the essay. The bibliography doesn't start on a separate page, and whether or not his bibliography is not in alphabetical order, I think it might have been, but it doesn't start on a separate page. He got 1 out of 4 for this, and it really didn't do him any favors. So it's just making sure that the formatting is right, and that's so easy to do, and it shouldn't be overlooked. Okay, sorry that it was a bit kind of rushed at the end. Hopefully it wasn't too bad. I'm pretty sure that you're going to have access to my slides afterwards or the recording. I'm now going to take some questions. So we just have a quick look. Somebody said they missed the answer to Justine's question, which was about writing about a text they took before DP. Yes, they can, as long as it's got enough literary merit. That's fine. So you're asking me questions about literature generally. If the selected text doesn't have much critical material available, if you're going to be in the literature one later, it's a good one to ask there, because that they're going to know more than I do, although I know quite a lot about literature anyway. But these are questions I think that you can ask for the subject specific sessions. So over to our moderator. Is there anything that you want to throw at me, or do you want me to go back through the chats?
You can just go through the chats, Emily, see if there are any questions. There are quite a few questions that have come in for you on the chat and in the Q&A panel. Yeah, so you can take those. Okay, no problem. Let me have a look. So our examples of formatting tables and images in the paper. Any examples? So formatting tables and images, again, it depends on which subject you do. I would say that, if you're doing images, you should always have your reference next to it. And again, making sure the students use appropriate nomenclatures like figure 1, diagram 1, and referring that back to in the text. And making sure the image is big enough for the examiner to see. I have so many economics essays where we have tiny graphs and the examiner's like, well, this isn't labeled, or in geography, no appropriate labeling of maps, making sure that there's all these things. Again, your subject specific sessions will help you with this, but geography is really important because you've got to have the map ratio, you've got to have all of the different areas like linked to, making sure that it's really obvious to the examiner what it is you're talking about, that you understand the map conventions. So really, really important. Let's have a look at some other things. Is there a way to get from the IB scores that show each criteria is grade from our students? Yeah, you'll only get, but you have to pay extra, unfortunately. And we do, because I think it's worth it for me. You don't have to necessarily get all of them, but you could, if your school is happy to pay for a few. I find as an EE coordinator, it's so useful. It's really invaluable to find out where the students lose marks, because that really helps me. Can a student write their World Studies EE from the same subject group, like group 4 biology? I believe that they can. That's one to put to Love, because he will know everything about world studies, and he's actually really good. I would say be careful with world studies in that you don't integrate two subjects which are too similar. So I would say biology and SEHS, biology and sport, too similar. Other things that are too similar are geography and ESS, for example, probably slightly too similar, but there might be some way that it depends on the topic, really. Can you elaborate the forward-looking aspect of the research question? I need you to just kind of, I need you to just kind of go into a bit more detail about that, because I'm not too sure what you mean by that. That was Mohammed. Is it okay if students give their personal opinion of the research? Yes, absolutely. And actually the IB like it if the student disagrees with a particular
piece of evidence that's been put forward, maybe by a historian or something. If the student disagrees and actually successfully argues their case based on some other evidence or their own opinion, I think that's absolutely fine. It actually looks like the student is really engaging with the source material, which is fab. Physics influence in EE and maths. Again, I would say that is probably one to ask the subject-specific coordinator. Does language be essay have to be written in the target language? Yes, and their reflections also have to be written in the target language. If your student is writing an essay in Spanish, the reflections also have to be written in Spanish. So I always say to those students that I can't help them because I don't read Spanish. I can help them with French, but otherwise, no, their supervisor will have to help them with their reflections in that case. Is there a template disseminated that showing what the style of EE should look like? No, I would say to Robert, I would say that the most important thing is getting the student to look at exemplars. I get my students to look at as many exemplars as they possibly can in their chosen subject field, just to give them an idea of how things should be laid out, and good exemplars as well. I mean, you can look at the bad ones too, and you can pick up on, actually, what do you think went wrong here? But actually looking at A-grade exemplars are really useful. Combination of history and global politics. So interestingly, history and world studies, again, good one for love, but it's still got to be a contemporary issue. So it may be something that, I'll give you an example actually. Our student this year did the COVID-19 pandemic and looked at it in relation to the Spanish flu pandemic, and he combined biology and history. And because it was a contemporary issue, COVID, he actually was able to draw on, what happened during the Spanish flu. Were the measures that they implemented there effective, and how much overlap was there in terms of government policy, that kind of stuff. So it's actually really, really interesting, and that actually I feel that worked. But there'll be other instances probably which won't. It just depends on the contemporary issue and whether you can bring in the historical factor and compare and contrast. And I think that's all from there. So we come down to the bottom again. Yes, a few inputs for visual arts. Yeah, we don't get many visual arts, but we do have a few, and most of them, we did have one this year where she was looking at, I think, the representation of women in sort of modern art. Some of our visual arts ones do okay, some of them don't. We had one last year actually that got a B grade, and she looked at Japanese kimonos, and she actually went to an exhibition in one of our museums of kimonos. It just happened to be very fortuitous that it was there, and she was just looking at that in terms of kind of contemporary Japanese culture and how it was represented. And she did all right. She got a B, so that was really good. Visual arts, I would say the most important thing with visual arts is making sure that it's subject-specific terminology that's being used. Making sure that images are very, very highly used, lots of images in the essay to demonstrate, and then the student then pulls on those images and demonstrates, their argument from the images, because you're using that as your source. So very important. And I think that's probably what I would say about visual arts essays. But anything else, if you want to ask me any specific questions about visual arts, I'm happy to answer. Wondering if Catherine, welcome. Complexity of a topic gives an advantage to the student. No, not necessarily. I would say the student needs to be careful to make sure that the topic that they're talking about, they understand. I find that a lot of our economics essays, particularly, were ones that the students just didn't understand economic theory, and therefore they wrote it wrong in their essay and lost marks for it. So it depends on the student, it depends on the topic. Some topics I would say, if the student should understand at least 70 to 75% of the topic, and maybe they could push themselves to learn more about that other 25%. So that's also quite good. It just depends on the nature of it. I mean, a student can write, I would say even a student who's perhaps not that academic could probably write a very good English essay, because they would be able to, analyze the piece of literature and draw on kind of literary concepts and themes. I find, for me, I always tend to point my weaker students in the direction of English, because I say you've been doing English or history, maybe because you've been doing English and history for years, and maybe this year you've just started economics. It's really new. You might not necessarily want to do an essay in economics. It's up to them at the end of the day, but I don't think you necessarily have to make a topic too complex to still be able to write about it, because you're doing the literature review, you're doing the research skills, and you're writing about what you know and being able to argue, something. So, I see questions which look quite simple on the surface, but actually have been really effectively argued. So, yeah. Graphs and calculations.
Yeah,
sorry.
I want to take the last question because we need to wrap up the session, and then I can hand it over to Ms. Ba. Yeah.
No problem at all. So graphs and calculations, would you add them to the body of the essay or the appendix? Graphs, I think if they're essential to the answering the research question, graphs should go in the body of the essay. Basically, the examiner will not necessarily read the appendix. They don't have to read the appendix. So anything that needs to be in the body of the essay should be in the body of the essay. Now, what the examiner doesn't want to see is pages and pages of raw data in the body of the essay, because it detracts from the argument. So as long as your calculations in there are, appropriate to the answering the research question, then I would say, they should be in the body of the essay. Anything that's kind of incidental, like, survey results or whatever, or raw data, should be in the appendix. Okay. Right. Okay. I'm gonna wrap it there. If there's any other questions I haven't answered, the moderator will put them through to me. But thank you so much, everybody, for attending the session. It's been really great to be with you today.
Thank you so much, Emily, once again for this wonderful session. If you've had a chance to look at the chat, then you know that everyone is so grateful for the information that you have shared today. I think everyone who joined is taking away very, very useful insights. So thank you once again.